Good afternoon and welcome to this Personnel Today webinar in association with Syndio. It's 7 years now since larger employers in the UK had to begin taking snapshots of their salary data and reporting their gender pay gaps. But global employers have much more to contend with as pay transparency rules across the world become increasingly commonplace. Last year's adoption by the European Union of its Pay Transparency Directive represents an imminent challenge as member states have to introduce or update their legislation before 2026. I'm Rob Moss, I'm editor of Personnel Today, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Ceris Pike, Global Reward Lead at AstraZeneca, and Christine Hendrickson, Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at Syndio. We're going to discuss how to transform these pay transparency challenges into opportunities for growth and for trust building in your workforce. In a moment, I'll ask our panelists to introduce themselves, but we also want to hear from you, the audience. Please do share your comments in the chat panel at any time. Perhaps kick off now by letting us know where you're joining the call from. If you have any specific questions that you want me to relay to Christine and Ceris, then please try and put these in the questions tab, which is the next one along, so we can more readily spot them. And I'll try and relay as many of those questions and comments to our panel as possible. Today's session is being recorded, and after we're done, we'll be sending you an email so you can download the slides or watch the webinar on demand. Okay, let's get moving. Ceris, welcome. Could you start just by introducing yourself and your role at AstraZeneca?
Hi there, I'm Ceris Pike. I've been with AstraZeneca for almost 4 years. I work in our global reward partnering team, so I partner with various functions and countries across our global business, supporting them to, implement and navigate our global reward policies and framework. In addition to that, for the last few years, I have been leading on our global pay equity strategy, which has now expanded and evolved to cover pay transparency in addition to pay equity, given obviously the high profile and very prominent nature of this topic in the global arena.
Perfect, thanks. And now I'll hand over to Christine, who's going to introduce herself and also begin our presentation.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's great to see so many people joining from all around the globe. And I think that is showing exactly what we're seeing at Syndio. So my name is Christine Hendrickson. I sit on Syndio's strategy team at Syndio. Syndio is a workplace equity platform. We help employers do things like run pay equity analyses, file their global pay reports, respond to the EU Directive, look at their opportunity gaps, and maintain it by setting pay. So we're lucky to work with over 300 large and leading employers on this work, and we work with the likes of Siemens and Nokia and many other leaders. So really thrilled to be with you all today. I was going to talk when we were talking through this. Rob and I were talking about the fact that there's really kind of three strategies that employers are having to employ. But before we got into that, I think that Rob wanted to bring in the audience to a conversation about where they are on this journey. So I'll turn this over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Christine. Yes, so we really just want to get an idea of who's in the audience and where you are. A lot of what we're going to be talking about is the EU Pay Transparency Directive. So keen to know how you're preparing for that. So there's a poll here. If you quickly share your reactions. So the options are still learning about requirements, starting to put a team together, creating an action plan, or you've done initial analysis. It may be that you don't have any EU operations, or perhaps you're not sure. So do vote, and I can just see that a lot of you are voting now. So around half our audience, Christine, are still learning about the requirements, but 5%, there's some very prepared people. They've created an action plan. So I'll hand back to you.
Perfect. Yeah. So it's interesting to see these, because that's exactly what we're seeing as we're working with employers, kind of approaching the directive and their broader strategies. I think that what we're really seeing is that there's kind of three interlocking strategies. So there's a strategy around your pay equity, and for many years, employers in the UK, across Europe, certainly across the United States, were conducting pay equity analyses across their organization, kind of identifying gaps and working to close those gaps. And employers were doing that through a variety of different methods, but as in my prior life, I'm a labor and employment attorney by background. So in my prior life, I was the co-chair of the pay equity group at Saifar Shah. And in that capacity, and certainly at Syndio, we were working with many, many large organizations to run pay equity analysis, run regression analyses, and look at those. And the idea is that for a long time, employers were looking for like a more of a global strategy, where there were kind of local requirements, local pay reporting requirements in existence, as Rob mentioned, in the UK for a number of years. And that was true elsewhere as well. But those ran kind of in parallel. So you may have your pay reporting obligations, but generally speaking, employers were not aligning their annual pay equity or many times a year pay equity analyses to comply with their pay reporting obligations. The pay reporting obligations were something that they did as a check the box to ensure that they were in compliance with the regulatory requirements, certainly as a conversation that they were having with their employees about where they were from a pay equity, but it typically was not bleeding into the discussion around how they were running their overall kind of pay equity. And in the last few years, we've seen two major changes happen that has changed this landscape really considerably. The first one is that we've seen this wave of pay transparency laws. Certainly the global high watermark on pay transparency is the EU's Equal Pay and Transparency Directive, which we're going to talk about today. But it's not the only one. We were seeing transparency laws broadly implemented across the United States, where the US went from only 18% of jobs having pay ranges in 2020 to just 2.5 years later, over 50% of jobs in the US include pay ranges. And right now across Europe, we're at about 20%. So we're kind of right in the middle of that happening across Europe as well. So we had these three strategies. We had your check the box pay gap reporting that you were doing with the government. That was happening in one silo. Sometimes you had these pay transparency rules and regulations, and then often you had the pay equity. And so I thought it was so fascinating, as I've had many conversations with Ceris around the scope of their work, and the scope of her work. It's this really expansive approach that these strategies are all blending together. And the biggest reason, especially as we look down the lens of the EU directive, is that one, we're going to have to explain a lot more about pay to our managers and to our leaders. And second, we have on the pay reporting, there's this mandatory requirement that we're closing pay gaps. And because of that, those strategies, that kind of three separate boxes of strategies for many employers, we're finding are really becoming a single strategy. And I think that a lot of that lands in the requirements for the EU directive. So as we were talking, and in the polling question was very interesting, because we were all curious about how many employers had moved from kind of understanding to fully actioning on, and it still sounds like there are a lot of employers that are still in that processing phase, and there's certainly a lot to process with the EU directive, but it lands in kind of these 5 key buckets. So most fundamentally, employers are going to have to group employees in groups of equal value. This is not new. It's not new. This concept is not new in the UK. It's certainly not. It's not new in the EU. The EU has had a requirement that we pay people for the same job, like for like work, and also work of equal value since Article 157. So for a very, very long time, this has been a requirement. But it's been almost this kind of toothless requirement because you've not had to do anything with it. So there could be, someone could sue on the basis that they felt like their pay was not paid at equal value. And we're seeing some of those lawsuits in the UK right now. But there wasn't a lot of requirements that you do much with that. And that all changes with the EU directive, because all of the other parts that we're going to talk about today are at their foundation is how are we going to group employees that are doing like for like work, but are also doing work of equal value across the organization. There's also a requirement around pay and career progression transparency, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail, the right to information. And then there's the piece it's been probably the subject of the most press, which is the pay reporting requirements. Whereas the pay reporting requirements primarily impact somewhat larger employers. So the first pay report will be due if you have more than 150 employees within a member state, due by the 7th of June, 2027. The other requirements, the transparency requirements, the right to information, those apply broadly across the board for the most part. There's one piece that employers can, member states can choose to set at a limit of 50 or more employees. But for the most part, those requirements kick in if you have any employees. So for folks in the UK that have primarily employees that are in the UK, that would be that just wanted to mention that those requirements are going to be applicable to you quite broadly. Those requirements also may kick in earlier. So the member states all must transpose by the 26th of June, the 7th of June of 2026. But that may actually be coming sooner than we think. So what we are hearing at Syndio is that Germany is aiming to put out a first draft of their iteration of the EU directive in the next couple of months, with an idea of transposing in 2025. And so even though this seems like a far ways off, it seems like it's coming a lot sooner than we think. And also, even on the pay transparency, or excuse me, on the pay reporting side, where some employers are like, well, that's not going to apply to me because I don't have 100 or 50 or more employees in any individual member state, or in the longer term at 100 or more employees. Those thresholds could be lower in some member states, because right now, if we look at where we have the pay reporting, there are 13 countries that are in the EU that have current reporting obligations. So across Europe, there are 18 countries that have some kind of pay reporting obligation of one sort or the next. Of those 18, 13 of them sit within the European Union. And of those 13, 11 have lower thresholds for reporting than is required by the EU directive. And because the EU directive is meant to only raise and not lower the bar for individual member states, it's very likely that we're going to see even smaller thresholds for reporting. So for example, in Sweden, the reporting kicks in if you have 10 or more employees. And next year in Ireland, it's going to be 50 or more employees. And so these thresholds can be quite low for reporting. And of course, it's not just the reporting that's happening in Europe. There are 5 countries in the Americas: Brazil, Canada. Brazil's new to this list. Ecuador is new to this list. There's pay reporting in some states in the United States. And then we have reporting in Australia and India and Israel, Japan, Korea, and South Africa. So this is truly a global phenomenon, and it's a growing one. So there's currently 29 countries in the world that have some kind of pay reporting. That's going to increase by 14 as the EU directive is transposed in the 14 countries in the EU that don't currently require reporting, places like Poland and the Netherlands, and you can see the rest of the list that don't currently have reporting requirements will soon have reporting requirements. So this is both a complicated, complex, and also growing landscape. The reporting requirements build upon, in many ways, what's required in the EU or required in the UK right now. So we're going to have to calculate those overall unadjusted gaps. And this list, the part in green, is going to look really familiar to those who have current reporting obligations in the UK. It's not identical, it's not tick for tack, but it's quite similar. So we're reporting overall means and medians. We're looking at means and medians by components of pay, whereas in the UK, we're only looking at bonus. And in Ireland, we're only pulling out bonus and benefits in kind. This is more expansive. We're going to have to look at all of the individual components of pay, more similar to what's required in Spain. But we're doing that exact same thing where we're looking at the proportion of men and women that received the allowances or bonuses or the like. It also includes things like benefits. We're also looking at the proportion in male and female workers in each pay quartile. So very similar in some ways, or at least directionally aligned to what's required in the UK. But this category of worker pay gap is where the rubber meets the road in the EU directive, because the EU directive requires that we calculate the mean or the average gap between men and women in categories of workers, and then it's broken out by components of pay. And again, that category of worker is broad. It means workers that are performing the same work or work of equal value. And this is really meaningful because if there are gaps of greater than 5%, you must correct them on that category of worker pay gap. So that overall pay gap is like what we see in the UK. It's more of like a naming and shaming kind of a requirement. So it's filed with the government, it's published on your website. You may need to explain why you have the pay gaps, but there's no requirement to close them, very similar to what we see in the UK. The category of worker pay gap is quite different and at a much higher bar, because while it's filed with the government, it must be shared with employees, must be shared with works counselors or other workers' representatives. And if there is a gap of greater than 5% in any category of worker that you can't explain, then you must correct it. And if you don't correct it, then you must go into a joint assessment with the Works Council or other worker representatives. So that's a big one. And that's really where we were talking about that we're seeing the merger of these two things, that it used to be that you could have your pay equity strategy and your pay reporting strategy, and they could be kind of in different lanes, but now they're all in one lane. And it's because of this, because of the category of worker pay gap, because you must both analyze it and you must correct it. And then the last thing, of course, is the pay and career progression transparency. And this is where the pay transparency path merges as well, because it's going to require doing things like sharing the pay scale information. And so if we're currently at 20% across Europe, and we went from about 18% in the US to over 50% in 2 years, I bet you if we look down the line and in a couple of years, we're going to see a very large number of roles that will include the pay range, or that information is being provided during the interview process. There's also a requirement that you can't ask about how much did you earn in your current role. I mean, it's such a common question that we ask in hiring, and it's something that's now forbidden. And then this requirement around pay and career progression transparency, that you have to make available to workers the criteria that's used to define their pay. Those first two on this list, those kick in even if you have a single employee in the European Union. The career progression transparency will kick in if there is there could be a minimum threshold of 50 or more workers, although individual member states could lower that threshold. And then the last one is this right to information that will require all employers, regardless of the number of employees, to provide the average pay between male and female workers in their own job category if an employee asks. So all of this together is quite a complicated soup, and I think that it shows a little bit of why it gets it's complicated for employers like Ceris to navigate. And of course, this is just the floor; it's not the ceiling. Individual member states can add additional obligations, and it is likely that we're seeing this trend of global cross-pollination, so that employers in the UK may see this on the horizon. So if you can see this a bit as the roadmap of what's to come, likely in the UK. So in the New Deal for working people issued in January, the Labour Party indicated that one of their initiatives is going further and faster with pay gap reporting. And you can imagine where that might go, because there's this roadmap or blueprint that's been created by the EU directive of around what those next steps could be. And we're seeing that very much, this cross-pollination of all of these rules happening.
Perfect. Okay, let's I just want to mention a couple of things from the chat. So there were some early questions about whether this applies to the UK. It doesn't. After Brexit, of course, it doesn't. But obviously, there are UK employers with operations in the EU and elsewhere. There are also European employers in the UK who will no doubt roll these strategies and policies out to their UK workforce, even if they're not obliged to do so. But as Christine just mentioned, the Labour Party has made various promises, and there's various press speculation about how it might go further and faster with pay gap reporting. Let's bring Ceris in a bit now. So I guess where to start, Ceris? What strategies or approaches are you using AstraZeneca or hearing from similar organizations and from people that you meet when you're networking to start to prepare for these changes or to enhance the transparency of your pay structures?
Yeah, so thanks, Rob. And I think it was really interesting, the outcome of the poll, because I wasn't at all surprised to see almost half of people were in, the first category where we're still learning about the requirements. And I think, that is very common and to be expected. And I think there's just so much uncertainty at the moment because, yes, we've got the general framework, but you don't know how that's going to be, transposed into the local legislation. And there's a lot to think about. So I hope everybody, on this call now feels like they're not alone in, just being at the start of that journey. And for us at AstraZeneca, I put down B because we're in that place where, we are just starting to pull the team together to look at this. And so I would say, the first thing to think about really is, who do you want to be on that team? Because actually our team at AstraZeneca covers actually a wide range of functions. So we've got reward people in there, we've got talent acquisition people, we've got people from our legal team, we've got, HR business partners, we've got people in global roles, people coming from, in-country roles, really to help us bring together all of those different perspectives and to make sure that we're really thinking broadly and covering all of those key points and understanding any potential hurdles or challenges that we might be facing. And I think for us, the key question that we're really thinking about at the moment is how do we deliver this? We're a very large global organisation, and typically these initiatives, these kind of reporting activities have been led locally. But this is becoming now a big global issue. We know more is coming in the EU. We're expecting that to happen more broadly. What should our global standard look like? How do we pull it all together and have a cohesive approach that we can deliver effectively, efficiently, but still staying on top of those kind of local differences and the local nuances. Which is, when you're operating in so many different countries, quite a challenging and complex landscape. But, to get things moving, I think the first thing to think about really as well is your reward framework. So a company like AstraZeneca, obviously we're very large. We've got a very well-established and mature framework, job architecture, pay bands, etc. But I've been talking to people in other companies that, perhaps that's actually where you need to start, because you're going to need to have the right kind of framework in place. If you're going to be comparing jobs of equal value, which are those jobs? So how do we group our employees together? I saw someone put in the chat that they don't have pay bands. So, if you're going to be disclosing your pay bands, you need to have something to disclose, right? So that's probably step number one if you don't have that already. But even for us at AstraZeneca, there's still work to do. We need to make sure people are in the right job codes, that they're assigned to the right career levels, that we are, making sure that our data is really robust and clean for us to be able to work with. And then I think what we've done and what I would suggest that people think about doing is doing some kind of pay equity analysis as soon as possible. Because actually, yes, in 2027, you're going to be required to publicly disclose your pay gaps. But actually, if you've got a pay equity issue, now is the time to know about it, because then you've got time to be able to identify that and to take some necessary action before you have to, make that information publicly available. So again, I think that's probably, a foundation, if you want to build a strong foundation for pay transparency, making sure that you're really comfortable that your current pay is equitable. And then I think last but not least, the last key consideration for us is around technology. So, even when I think about, delivering the UK gender pay gap analysis annually, that takes an enormous amount of time to prepare. And that's not just the analysis, that's collecting all the data, pulling it together, and then, add on top of that the fact that you need to do that in so many different countries, that the legal framework might be slightly different country by country. That is a significant investment of time and resource. And so for us, a key question at the moment is about how we're going to do that in an efficient, effective way that enables us to scale up on a global basis, and to be ready, should another country, decide to bring these new laws in at any point, that we can actually mobilize our internal processes, and we're able to just pick that up and run with it really quickly and easily.
Perfect. Thank you, Ceris. I guess you're even thinking about the question of, like, do you need a global strategy, or is it best to do it all country by country by country? So that's interesting. We'll explore that a bit further in a while. Christine, shall I move on to the next poll? Yep, cool. Okay, so the question is, what concerns you most about the shifts to more pay transparency across Europe? And you should see that on your screen now. So the options are understanding and keeping up with the changing requirements, the logistics of gathering relevant data. You might be concerned about your employees or your unions, worker representatives seeing the pay ranges and the gaps. How do you communicate all of this, both internally and externally? And if you can think of some other concerns that you have, then please do share those in the chat. So let's just see how people are voting. So it's the top two are understanding and keeping up with the changing requirements. around 37%, and the logistics of gathering that data. I'll hand back to you now, Christine.
That's really, those numbers are, that's kind of what I would expect. What do you think, Ceris? Like, what are your takes on that? Data. You know, we've done these, Syndio is doing this series of roundtables all across Europe. I'm in Europe for living in London and moving to Amsterdam shortly. And we're doing this series of roundtables. And so at the Amsterdam roundtable just a little while ago, everyone was like very, very focused on the data. The other ones are communication, keeping up with those changing requirements. I would love to hear, Ceris, like what keeps you up at night about all of this?
Yeah, well, I was actually looking for the button that said all of the above.
Yeah.
Because it was actually quite hard to choose out of that list, which is the most concerning, the one that worries us here, and certainly, you know, the leaders in the business. But I think, you know, for us, definitely, you know, I mentioned earlier, just collecting the data causes a significant amount of work, and, you know, keeping on top of that, changing legislation equally. But I think, you know, when we're thinking about communication, this is really important. And I think when you're a large multinational employer, communication is always really difficult. It's never really easy. And so we've invested at AstraZeneca a lot of time and effort into our education program. But, you know, this isn't, I think in my experience, having our leaders and line managers talk about pay is not something that they're majorly comfortable with. It's something that they still feel is a bit of a taboo subject, and they'd rather not do it, or they'd rather somebody else was going to do it for them, would be their preference. And, you know, we have been investing a lot of time in education and trying to uplift the capability of our leaders and line managers, you know, to be able to understand how we reward people at AstraZeneca, and how we should be rewarding people equitably, because, right, you know, for us, that is the foundation of this whole approach. Because actually, yes, we need to be more transparent, but the reason, you know, for these, you know, shifts in legislation is to ensure that we have equity underlining all of our paid decisions. And so we've been really building capability in our line manager population to make those decisions in an equitable way, and also to be able to communicate them, you know, and to be kind of very confident. And I think it's that confidence building that's the really important part, to say, you know, this is how we pay people at AstraZeneca. This is why I am paying you what I am paying you.
Right.
This is how you compare to other people in the organization doing a similar job and you know, with a similar level of skills, experience, etc. And, you know, then when we become more transparent, actually, it's not a big fundamental shift for employees, because they've already been told by their line managers, and every time, you know, they have a reward conversation, they understand thoroughly why they're paid what they're paid. And that's really important to us, because one, you know, it builds trust. It's completely aligned with our values of doing the right thing. And, you know, it's fundamental to our approach to inclusion and diversity as well, that, you know, you have to pay people in an equitable way if you want to really deliver on your promises to the business around inclusion and diversity. So that's been a big effort for us, is really making sure that we are able to raise that capability and to help. But it's not just the line managers, and there is a lot that we can do as well to help the employees. And we want our line managers and our leaders to be focusing on those more complex topics. So giving the employees just a baseline knowledge of how do we determine pay at AstraZeneca? You know, what is it that influences the pay decisions that we make? You know, what is our policy around this? We can actually do that, you know, on a more centralized global basis, and free up our line managers time to just be having those one-on-one individual conversations.
Right.
And last but not least on this point, I think the other learning for me is that, this isn't a one and done thing. This is something you've got to keep on doing all the time.
Yeah.
So, you can't just tell line managers once this is what you need to communicate. You have to keep on reinforcing that, and you have to keep on evolving the information, because they're not going to invest time and time in the same information. So how do we get those bite-sized chunks of information out? How do we reach them when it matters? How do we really get them to engage with this topic and to keep it fresh and front of mind?
Yeah, I think that one of the conversations that Ceris and I have had around like the importance of communicating it on that regular and routine basis, so that it's chunked out, so it becomes like a part of that general approach, not just as a kind of one-off. I think that that's really important. Thanks for saying that. I think that that's so critical, and something that we've heard from others around, like the need to have like almost explainer videos, explainer one-pagers that are going out, so it's not just this one big long training where everyone sits down and like they learn it all and then they leave and then it's literally gone. But I like the way that surround sound concept that you were outlining, that it has to come in all of these different ways. I think that that's really critical. So that's a really important point.
Okay, perfect. There's plenty of comments coming through on the chat and in the questions tab. Please do keep sending those in. That's great. We'll just move along. Christine, should we go back to the slides momentarily before we?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this was something that Ceris had mentioned, and I'll really turn it over to you, Ceris, to talk. But what we're hearing a lot from at Syndio is this need to go from, especially on the reporting, but also on transparency and kind of generally from a more decentralized compliance, where it may be technically correct, it complies with the local requirements, but it's used as more of a check the box exercise that's not part of your brand story. We're seeing that employers are moving towards starting to tell their story. They're worrying about it. It's taking up, they are telling a great story, and they're able to incorporate their pay gap numbers and as part of their story, but it often takes a lot of resources and the like to being moved to something that's more coordinated and sustainable. The project that I lead at Syndio is actually right around this, is supporting the reporting in 29 jurisdictions for that reason, because it becomes, especially as we think about the EU directive, there was a bunch of questions that were coming in, is like, does this impact you in the UK, or does this impact you broadly? And I think that it's a little bit of, technically what is going to happen with the EU directive is the EU directive applies if you have any employees in the European Union. So if you have a few employees, some components of the EU directive will apply: the right to information, the need to provide the pay ranges, potentially the need to provide the career progression transparency, the salary history ban laws. All of that applies, even if you have one or two employees in the European Union. If you have a larger population in the European Union, then you may also have the pay gap reporting requirements. And then even if you don't have a single employee in the European Union, I think that what we want to say is that this is a globally evolving landscape, and that the EU directive is by far the most significant of pay equity legislation that's passed anywhere in the globe since the 1960s. So think of this as like the GDPR of pay equity. So like in the same way that the GDPR, while it may not impact you directly if you don't have employees in the EU, it has all of these ripple effects that turn out, because we're seeing other jurisdictions that take up similar requirements, and also because you're competing for labor in a market that now includes a lot of transparency. So even if you're in the UK what we've seen certainly in the US is that even in states that don't require it, large multinational employers are putting pay ranges on jobs. And so if you're an organization, not to call an AstraZeneca, but like an organization that has employees kind of across the board, you may end up, some of those organizations may end up putting pay ranges on jobs, even in the UK, because it's easier to comply in that kind of more consistent way. So that's a great question. But Ceris, like as we were talking about this need to go from this decentralized compliance to a more coordinated and sustainable, I'd love to hear where you are, and then maybe at the same time, should people vote, Rob, on?
Yep, I can get the poll running.
Okay.
But Ceris, feel free to start to discuss.
Yeah, so I think that we are probably in B at the moment. So, we're just starting to pull this together and understand what it is that we want to do and how we will be able to do this. But ultimately, we will want to get to a more coordinated approach. But I think at the moment we're still having a lot of discussion around this, what that actually means in practice, because we need to work through a lot of different scenarios, different implications of that approach, and where how that works with other structures that we have. We tend to be, AstraZeneca, using a center of excellence model. So we would set the frameworks, the approaches, the global standards, but still might be operated on a local basis. So there's nuances, I think, even when you get to your global strategic approach, that doesn't necessarily mean that you deliver everything from the center. Mm-hmm. There can be different ways to work that.
Okay, in terms of the results of that poll, so 40% are starting to tell their story. Mm-hmm. Nearly 30% don't know.
Yeah.
And then a quarter are saying decentralized compliance, and only 8% on coordinated and sustainable.
Right. And I think that's the what we're seeing is that it becomes almost like a forcing function, that it may be that you were able to do things at a local level that were compliant with the requirements in a very localized way. And you will need to continue to meet those the nuances of those individual approaches, but it also has to scale kind of across an organization. So yeah, that's really interesting.
I guess the next question we have lined up for you, Ceris, is around navigating the resistance, because I can imagine, just within one UK division, there might be resistance to any sort of new way of doing things. But across the globe, I guess the cultural differences as well that really come into play.
Yeah, so definitely. I mean, there is resistance at AstraZeneca. I'm sure it's the same at every employer to this change. I think there's a lot of fear about this, is the truth. Like, I've heard concerns about, we're going to have to pay everybody now. All candidates are going to expect the top end of the range. It's going to massively increase our costs. So all our employees are going to leave because they're going to realize they're not paid at the top of the range. We're not going to be able to hire anybody because our competitors will know what we pay people, so they'll just pay them more. So, these, hopefully others have heard similar concerns at their organizations, but these are common concerns that I hear. To some extent, people are just going to have to get on board with this, because we can't maintain the status quo. In the EU, we're going to have to become more transparent. We don't have the option to continue to keep pay hidden behind a closed door. And yes, okay, it may be that, you don't have to disclose to everybody, and you may just show it, at the interview selection stage. So, we haven't yet decided, what approach we will take, and we were waiting to see what the legislation in each country says before we, finally decide on the approach. But we know something is going to change. We know we're going to be more transparent. And so I think, the first thing that we have to do is to overcome this resistance is just to raise awareness. Because yes, in HR, we know this is coming, but not lots of people in the business don't know about it. So we need to start to talk about this new legislation, that it's coming, that it's going to impact, what it means. But I don't think we also necessarily always have to use that kind of, stick approach that says, you must do this because we're going to be forced to. There are positive reasons to do this as well. So we can reframe it into a positive way. I saw some Gartner research that said, 67% of candidates are more likely to apply for a job if there's a pay range on there. So actually, this is not a negative point that's going to make us less competitive. Actually, it's going to make us more competitive, because people are more likely to want to come and work for a company that is open and transparent and, provides this kind of information, up front. So I think that, that's really important. It's not just, it's about raising awareness, but not only just about the forcing element. It's about, the positives of doing this, and that there is, benefits of the change. But I think the other point about resistance is, it might just be too much for people to fathom going from where we are today to being fully transparent. So thinking about those incremental steps that you can make between now and 2027, or whenever we have to be fully transparent, how can we start to incrementally increase the level of transparency that we have in the business? So like, I was talking about, just starting to educate employees about how we determine pay ranges, like how we, differentiate pay, what factors do we use to determine the pay increases that people get during the annual cycle. So just being more kind of open and transparent about the policies and the approaches, without necessarily having to go big bang and publishing your pay ranges tomorrow. Right. Is another strategy, I think, that people can employ to try and bring people along on the journey, rather than kind of forcing this upon them. But I think that the other important point around communication is that, this idea of also pay gap reporting and being, disclosing our pay gaps, that generates a lot of fear in the business as well. So, coming back to the point about education, we need to help our line managers understand, quite complex concepts when it comes to these pay reporting. I mean, I don't know, how many people on this call would think whether their line managers really understand the fact that the gender pay gap in the UK, for example, actually measures your representation.
Right.
Difference in pay between people doing like work. And so, you get these big headlines and you get people running around the business saying, this is terrible, we've got this pay gap. And, you can usually help them understand what it actually means. But we need to be on the front foot as well when these new reporting requirements are coming out, to help our line managers, be able to be less afraid of that.
Right, build that muscle. Yeah. Right,
build that muscle. Be less afraid of it. They have to understand what it actually means. Mm-hmm. That even, you might have a 5% difference, 5% gap, but it's for justifiable reasons. So actually, as long as it can be explained, then that is acceptable. So I think, it's a journey. We've got a couple of years to work on it. And it will take a lot of effort to get there, but we have to start somewhere, I suppose. And this is now.
Perfect.
And I think that one other thing on the timeline is that It is a journey, and it's also one where the sooner that you jump into it, I think that it's going to make the next steps smoother, because the more that you can go to your works council, your workers representatives with a well kind of crafted, these are the ways that we're going to be thinking through this, and bring them into that conversation. But it requires understanding where you are kind of baseline at an organization first. I think the better. And the other thing is that although the reporting piece, the directive must be transposed by June of 2026, the reporting is not until June of 2027, but it's based on your 2026 data. So for the EU directive, and that data, then this next comp cycle, the one that occurs for most employers, kind of March, April timeline of next year, is really your last opportunity to make adjustments that will then be baked into that 2026 reporting. And so I think what we're hearing a lot is prioritizing getting our arms around those pay gaps and beginning to address that, and then plan out on the strategy around the pay transparency piece, so that can be sequenced in a way that it's not like all of it at once, but it gets those early things done on an earlier side. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Ceris, you make a really good point about the public or employees understanding about pay gaps versus equal pay. It's not really understood very well at all. And even having been writing about gender pay gaps for the last 8 years or however long it's been, there are times when we have to, in our editorial office, we really put our heads together to think about, what does this actually mean?
How can we say this in a different way?
Yeah, exactly. So, okay, both of you do look through the chat and the questions, any that you may wish to answer. There was one, Ceris, around whether or not AstraZeneca currently has pay bans. I just wondered if you wanted to answer that. But a question, I guess, associated with that for you, Christine, is there any prescription within the directive that talks about how you build those bands? There were a few questions in the chat. Can you just make the bands up? Can you make the bands really, really wide or really narrow? Ceris, first of you, does AZ have that?
So yes, we do. We have a pay band for every job in every country. So I think globally we've got something like 13,000 pay bands. It's quite a complex job architecture and pay framework in AstraZeneca. We are going through the process at the moment of assessing, where we want to get to from a transparency perspective in terms of disclosing pay bands. Obviously, we will always do what we have to do to be compliant. But when we're looking at this global standard, as I said, we've just kicked off the project team to look at this and think about how we determine this global standard. That is something that we are looking at. So, do we do what we have to do in certain countries, or do we have a global standard? So we don't have a decision on that. As I said, we're just starting to have those discussions and weigh up the pros and cons of each approach.
Okay, so Christine, how do you set the bands, or are there requirements from the EU around how you do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this concept of category of worker flows through some of the pay reporting requirements currently as part of the EU. So the concept is not new. It's just the kind of full realization of it. Right now, different member states kind of do it a little bit differently. So in places like in France, in their reporting, you can report by socio-professional category, or you can use things like your coefficient or your collective agreement, sometimes in grades or levels. And that's considered to be any of those approaches are acceptable. The requirements vary a little bit, but those concepts are applicable across the board. Others use, different usage groups and the like. So I expect that the directive instructs the member states to provide more guidance on grouping of employees. But I would also imagine if we look at the 13 member states that have current pay reporting, there is a fair amount of flexibility in terms of how employers group employees. And in fact, the directive is clear that they're not going to be prescriptive around it must be this way. There are touch points. I think that the one thing is that it likely cannot be functional. So it probably cannot be your engineers in your grade 6 engineers. It will likely have to be more cross-functional, because one of the things that the EU directive was targeted at was eliminating kind of that functional segregation that happens where there are groupings of roles, less technical roles, for example, where there tends to be a higher concentration of women, and those roles tend to be paid at a lower rate. So that would be the one thing that I would keep into mind, that it's likely that you're going to have to look a little bit more cross-functionally, although at least on the work of equal value.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I guess, that's kind of reflected in various legal cases already.
Exactly. That's exactly what we're seeing, and that's true in the UK too, as we have, as we're seeing the litigation around grocery store workers in distribution roles and in roles. Same concept, exact same concept.
There's an interesting. There are a few points made in the chat. I guess there's a question from Anne which talks about what about new employees who are offered a higher rate to attract them to a role. I guess so regardless of gender. I mean, is this something that is dealt with by the legislation, or is that going to be something that's going to come out through case law?
Yeah, exactly. So not directly. What the directive says is that you can explain reasons for pay gaps in ways that are gender neutral. And so if those are kind of broadly applied across the board, you're hiring for kind of hot skills jobs. We have had employers analyze pay to the extent that they track that information. It kind of comes out, but it's a tricky one, because sometimes what happens is the hot skills are applied to jobs that tend to be more male dominated, and then you get into the question of like, is that actually a gender neutral criteria? But that's a great question, and I'd love to talk more about that one, and because it's a complicated one, and one that we think about a lot as we're doing regression analyses.
Oh, that was another question. Last question. Someone asked, I can't remember who it was, I'll find it now. Do you use regression analyses, Christine?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that for larger employers, the only way that it's going to be scalable to Ceris's earlier points around doing this in a way that is iterative and also scalable, I think is really important. I think that doing a regression analysis is certainly going to be part of that for larger employers, because it's going to be very difficult to be able to identify those gaps if you don't have something like a regression analysis to help assist with that.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you. So that question on regression analysis came from Andrew.
How would you use a regression analysis in reporting? So it's actually not in the reporting. The reporting is going to be the raw gaps. Where it's used is, can you explain the gaps of greater than 5 in the value category of worker pay equity analysis? Can you use that to explain the reasons for the pay gaps? That's where that comes in.
Okay, perfect. Well, sorry to all those people who've made points and asked questions that we didn't have time for. My thanks to Ceris and Christine for their insights into this important topic, which I'm sure is going to just get more important as time goes on. And we will all be waiting to see in the next 6 months what the Labour Party will be promising, to see how much this might affect the UK even more than it already does.